Now, let me get you first. You maybe set the tripod like right over the corner.
Scene 10, take 1.
I am not here to knock going to college. If a young person has the opportunity to go and has the character and intelligence to take advantage of it, it's a good thing. But going to college is not the same as getting an education, though the two are often confused. A boy or a girl can go to college and get a degree, not much else. On the other hand, a boy or a girl in a shop, factory, or store can get an education without a degree if they make up their mind to it. They have to want to learn. They have to be willing to talk to those who are wiser than themselves, to be observing, to keep their ears and eyes open, and to set apart some time every day to read. They have to struggle harder than those who go to college. But if they are willing to make the effort, the struggle gives them power. They get their education from contact with the realities of life, and not just from books.
John Dewey was 70 when this newsreel footage was shot, in which he distinguished education from mere schooling. This was a rather surprising position for a famous professor to take in the mass media of the day. After all, he was in his 45th year of university teaching, and he had already written more than a dozen books. He would live another 22 years and published almost that many more. What this short newsreel clip reveals is Dewey's remarkable ability to envision possibilities beyond his own experience, his faith in the intelligence of average citizens, and his openness to the use of new technologies, even ones that exposed his innate shyness, which is apparent in this clip. These qualities were to be profoundly important in his scholarly writings and his involvement in human affairs. Hello, I'm Larry Hickman. I'm here today at the Center for Dewey Studies at Southern Illinois University, Carbondale. Much of my professional life has been devoted to the study of John Dewey. In this short piece, we hope to introduce you to the life and work of this visionary thinker who in many ways lived ahead of his time. During his long and productive life, Dewey wrote scores of books and articles about psychology, philosophy, art, and social issues. To give you an introduction to this wealth of material, we're organizing this presentation around three general topics that are recurring themes in his work. The themes that we'll be pursuing are his analysis of human learning, his understanding of truth as a process instead of something absolute and unchanging, and his faith in democracy as the only means of social organization that can foster individual fulfillment and its implications for education and the arts. Like all of us, Dewey was profoundly influenced by the historical and technical changes of his time. In the course of his 92 years, he witnessed dramatic changes in almost every aspect of human life. When he was born, on October 20, 1859, Abraham Lincoln had not yet been elected president. The Civil War was no more than a storm cloud on the horizon. He died during the presidency of Dwight D. Eisenhower, after two horrific world wars, one of which was ended by the atomic bomb. At the time of Dewey's birth, most Americans were dependent on wind, water, and wood technologies. During that year, 1859, America drilled its first oil well, which led to many of the technologies that we now take for granted. Also during 1859, Charles Darwin's culture-shattering work, The Origin of Species, was published. This book was to have a major influence on Dewey's thought. John Dewey was born in Burlington, Vermont, the third of 4 sons of Archibald Sprague Dewey and Lucina Artemisia Rich Dewey. During the Civil War, his father, a grocer by trade, served in the 1st Vermont Cavalry as a quartermaster. It's almost certain that the young John Dewey witnessed the devastation of that great war when the family joined Archibald at his post in Northern Virginia in 1864. In 1867, the family returned together to Burlington. The Burlington of Dewey's youth was a center of immigration and industrialization. The ethnic, class, and religious diversity that young Dewey experienced there may have helped prepare him for the experiences with diverse cultures that he would seek out during the rest of his life, both in urban America and abroad. Dewey studied philosophy at the University of Vermont, graduating in 1879. He continued his study of philosophy after graduation while employed as a high school teacher in the boom town of Oil City, Pennsylvania. In 1882, he entered the new doctoral program at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, where he studied logic, the new experimental psychology, and neo-Hegelian philosophy. After completing his doctorate 2 years later, he accepted a teaching position at the University of Michigan. During Dewey's decade in Michigan, his personal life changed dramatically. He met and fell in love with an intelligent, socially progressive student named Harriet Alice Chipman. The two were married in 1886 and would eventually have 7 children. Alice Dewey's involvement in progressive causes such as securing the vote for women and defending the rights of ethnic minorities had a great influence on John Dewey's growing awareness of social injustice. The course of Dewey's intellectual life also underwent major changes during his years in Ann Arbor. He began to reject most of the claims of traditional metaphysics and to develop a pragmatic notion of truth. This is an idea that we will return to later. During this period, Dewey was greatly influenced by William James' Principles of Psychology, published in 1890. James thought of habits as active forces in human life. He treated belief as a kind of habit. In his view, beliefs as well as other types of habits are really rules for action. Beliefs are identifiable in terms of the results they produce. James's new dynamic psychology was exactly what Dewey had been looking for to support his own theories about how we learn. In 1894, the recently founded University of Chicago appointed Dewey as head of its Department of Philosophy, which included psychology and pedagogy, or what we now call education. Dewey would excel in all 3 disciplines. By the age of 46 in 1905, he had served as president of both the American Psychological Association and the American Philosophical Association, and he was one of America's best-known educators. Dewey's association in Chicago with social reformer Jane Addams and his involvement with Hull House, where she provided community services, afforded him first-hand knowledge of the poverty and despair of the hundreds of thousands of immigrants who were attempting to make their living in Chicago during the 1890s. Although the Deweys were only in Chicago for 10 years, those were crucial years for their lives and work. Both Deweys were thoroughly involved in the education of their own children and close observers of their learning processes. These experiences, and John's experiments in psychology, led him in 1896 to found an elementary school that would serve as a laboratory for the university's new Department of Education. Earlier I said that Darwin's Origin of Species had been a major influence on Dewey's thought. Dewey took one of Darwin's central concepts and applied it to the fields of psychology and philosophy. This was the idea that species are not fixed, but undergoing constant change. Dewey combined this idea, the tendency of organisms to adapt, with his own observation that the existence of living organisms is rhythmic, alternating between phases of imbalance and equilibrium. In 1896, Dewey worked out some of the consequences of these ideas in an article entitled The Reflex Arc Concept in Psychology. This watershed essay was to have a major impact on the fields of philosophy, psychology, and education. Even now, more than 100 years after its publication, it's still the subject of extensive interest and discussion. The basic idea of the reflex arc went back at least as far as René Descartes in the 17th century. Descartes had developed a mechanical model according to which an external impulse, say from a burned foot, activates a kind of cord or cable attached to the brain. The brain then activates another cable attached to the foot, thus completing the reflex arc. In his Principles of Psychology, published in 1890, William James sought to improve this traditional reflex arc model, which he thought was too mechanical. First, James replaced Descartes' image of a man next to a fire with a more modern image of a child reaching for a candle. According to the old mechanical model, a child sees a candle. That's the stimulus. The child then reaches for the flame. That's the response. The flame burns the child's finger. That's another stimulus. And the child withdraws her hand. That's another response. In both sequences of the child's behavior, the seeing reaching and the feeling the burn withdrawing the hand, there was said to be an arc from the external stimulation of the sense organs to a response set up by the internal working of the child's brain. James attempted to improve on this model by emphasizing the associations produced in the child's mind and the new habit that they produced. In this case, the new habit was the child's withdrawing her hand in the presence of a flame. But Dewey was still not convinced. He thought that the reflex arc model was fatally flawed because it amounted, as he put it, to a series of jerks that were unable to account for the rich coordination of situations and processes that make up even the simplest of human learning experiences. His own analysis of the learning experience begins not with a stimulus that is external to the organism, but with a stimulus that is a coordinated act involving the sensory and motor actions of the child and the context in which the situation occurs. The context includes such things as the child's past experiences, the environment in which the event takes place, and her level of engagement, or how involved she is in the experience. All of these factors shape the episode and the learning that takes place, or doesn't, as a result of it. For Dewey, as it would be later for Jean Piaget, learning is not a series of truncated arcs, but a continuing circuit, or rhythm of imbalance and restored equilibrium. The learner is not a passive recipient of experience, but an active player within it, bringing with her a set of complex behaviors and expectations from past events. Now, Dewey's analysis, as he later elaborated it in his 5-step description of effective learning, also known as the method of intelligence, goes like this. A child in a state of equilibrium, say playing with a familiar toy, comes upon something unexpected. Her equilibrium is disturbed. The situation is now unstable, and this instability triggers an emotional response. The child attempts to make the situation more stable by applying lessons learned from past experiences. The new situation calls for exploration, just as previous ones have. This phase of learning involves an intellectual response. Now that the problem has been defined as something that requires exploration, the child uses a familiar method. She reaches for the candle. Her reach for the candle is a test of the proposed solution. In the past, she has grasped objects in order to become better acquainted with them. But now her attempt to apply this familiar solution results in a burned finger. If the burn sensation is sufficient to prevent further exploration, the child has completed the circuit of learning. She now knows about the effect of flames on fingers and has thus added a new circle of adjustment to her understanding of the world. The problematic situation has been resolved. As an organism, she is once again in a state of equilibrium. If the burn is not sufficient to prevent further exploration, the experiment starts all over again until the lesson is learned and equilibrium is restored. Dewey insists that learning always begins in the middle of things.
Fill in the circle under the picture whose name begins.
The learner is not a blank slate upon which ideas are to be written,
Now find the guess.
nor is his or her mind a cabinet into which facts are to be filed away. Each learner is a living organism with his own history, his own needs, his own desires, and perhaps most importantly, his own interests. As we saw in the newsreel clip, Dewey thought that learning takes place outside as well as inside the schoolroom. But it is in the context of the University of Chicago Elementary School that Dewey's ideas about learning received their most rigorous tests. This school was opened in the same year that Dewey published his Reflex Arc article. From 1901 until 1904, Alice would serve as its principal. The laboratory school was a laboratory in fact as well as in name. Dewey never intended it to be a model that other schools should follow. Nor did he think that any school would ever be a perfect model. In his view, education always reflects the circumstances of the times and students involved. It should evolve as these elements change. Dewey's educational ideas were in part a rejection of the rote, curriculum-driven approach to learning that was the standard method of his day. Dewey also rejected the opposite concept, the exaggerated child-centered approach. In his view, the child-centered approach uncritically follows the impulses and uninformed interests of the child. Unfortunately, Dewey's term progressive education has too frequently been used as a put-down phrase to describe such educational practices, practices that involve what Dewey rejected as planless improvisation. In Dewey's view, the challenge of education should be to integrate the educational subject matter with the talents and interests of the learner.
Really hard. Hermes came and told Calypso, if you don't let Odysseus go, Zeus is going to make your island go back down into the ocean.
As we will see, Dewey often overcame either-or dichotomies by looking beyond the conflicts they presented. At the lab school, children learned traditional academic subjects such as arithmetic, reading, and science. But they were also taught skills such as weaving, carpentry, cooking, and art. These practical skills were presented as examples of problem solving, but they were also taught as embodiments of more abstract forms of knowledge and as providing important tools for undertaking further discoveries. If education is adjustment within an environment, as Dewey thought, then it is the whole person that adjusts and not just the part of the organism we call the intellect. Deborah Meyer, principal of Mission Hill School in Boston, has been a force for extending the scope of Dewey's methods.
Like John Dewey, Mission Hill School's task is to think about how we can make schools help prepare young people for real life and use the academic disciplines not for the purpose of teaching the disciplines, but for teaching young people how to confront real-life problems. And central to those real-life problems is the question of being strong democratic citizens. Our school, Mission Hill, is a public school in Boston, and we serve 164 students between the ages of 5 and 14. Dewey's 5-step analysis of the process of inquiry applies to how our students go about their learning. For instance, this 6th grade class is studying support and structure as part of physical science. The entire school has been studying ancient Greece, from the 5-year-olds through the 14-year-olds. And these particular students were intrigued that slim pillars held up such enormous loads.
Not yet. Do you think more?
This curiosity about the nature of material strength and function led to further explorations.
Wow.
Their teacher challenged them to build a structure 11 inches high that would hold a heavy load, using only 100 index cards. The children had to realize the task involved modifying their materials. An important task of education, I feel, is to expand the ways one can look at any situation. They then applied their previous knowledge of the strength of columns and formulated plans to build their structures. Their ability to make useful hypotheses evolved from their knowledge base and experience of how columns work.
They supported like huge buildings.
These students then subjected their hypothesis to testing, in this case with quite dramatic results.
This is a Nantucket weather glass, and I want to see how accurate it really is.
In other situations, the testing involves collecting data.
It's what really happened. The green is what it predicted, and the orange, it wasn't accurate.
Legitimate reasons for why we want to wear hats.
I think you should have a test.
Or with imaginary, dramatic rehearsals, to use Dewey's terminology, for what-if thinking.
What would you do then?
If it don't work, we should keep it back to without wearing hats.
Did experiments with these cardboard tubes.
The final application of knowledge sometimes comes immediately.
So what's happening now?
In other situations, it comes much later.
We're trying to find out how much weight the paper tubes can hold.
Our students aren't all intending to become structural engineers, but we feel this kind of problem solving prepares them for reasoned inquiry in other situations and preparation for the more theoretical physics they will encounter a few years later in high school.
Circle can hold, I think, around 3 books, and triangle can hold like 1 or 2.
Learning to apply the methodology of reasoned inquiry to scientific, social, and artistic situations has been the great legacy of civilization, and one that is basic to a democracy. Dewey's 5-step description of how we go about solving problems in learning, what he called the method of intelligence, is not meant to be a kind of a cookie cutter, stamping out uniform experiences. Each episode of learning is unique. This brings us to Dewey's view of the nature of truth. Some philosophers, who we might call absolutists, have argued that there are statements that are forever absolute and unchanging. Moral laws, such as the Ten Commandments, physical laws, such as the speed of light, and mathematical equations, such as 10 divided by 3 equals 3 1/3, are often cited as examples of such certainties. Other philosophers, often termed relativists, have argued that all truth is relative. Whatever a culture or an individual thinks is best for them is true for them. In their view, truth is accidental or arbitrary. If it feels good, do it. Typically, Dewey found something of value in both of these extreme views, even though he rejected their central claims. Drawing on his analysis of the reflex arc, he argued that truth is neither absolute nor arbitrary. A belief is true when it is the product of objective, experimental inquiry. But inquiry may lead to different truths in different situations. So Dewey's reflex arc research led him to the conclusion that truth depends on factors such as interest, habit, and context. If the child had not been interested in the bright light, or if she had not had the habit of touching things in order to learn about them, she would never have discarded the old truth in favor of the new one. There would have been no learning. Dewey argued that moral laws, physical laws, and even mathematical laws are true only as regulative principles. Regulative principles are principles that shape our behavior, all things being equal. They are general rules of action that have been so thoroughly refined over time that it is highly unlikely that they'll ever need to be revised. In general, for example, touching objects is usually a good way to find out about them. When we attempt to apply such principles, however, we find that actual conditions create exceptions. Moral truths, for example, such as the regulative principle, do not kill, are subject to exceptions such as the defense of one's person, family, or country. Physical truths, such as the speed of light is 186,000 miles per second, may also have exceptions. In 1999, for example, a Harvard physicist slowed the speed of light to 38 miles per second in her laboratory. Several months later, she was able to stop it altogether. Along with the rest of us, Dewey would probably have been surprised at this particular result. Even so, he had already provided a place for it in his theory of truth. The same can be said of mathematical truths. Take the well-known equation that says 10 divided by 3 equals 3 1/3. Dewey argued that this equation is only a guide and not an absolute truth. Its application is subject to the pressure of real events.
Ready, set,
For example,
go.
you cannot divide 10 children into 3 equal groups.
And,
The
get
best
your
you can
groups.
do is to get 2 groups with 3 and 1 with 4, not 3 groups with 3 1/3 children
Go.
each. Sometimes even well-established regulative principles undergo dramatic change. Before Galileo, for example, most astronomers thought the Earth was the center of the universe. Now, of course, it is a truth, or to use Dewey's term, a regulative principle, of astronomy that the Earth revolves around the Sun. Will that truth ever change? Probably not. But Dewey argued that if our knowledge is to grow, we must always be open to new experiences.
Roger that. Stand by for mode 1.
Up until 1999, for example, it seemed inconceivable that the speed of light could ever be modified. As for the relativists, who think that truth is just arbitrary or accidental, Dewey realized that they are correct in the sense that cultural practices are different in different parts of the world, and that each of us has our own unique perspective. But he also argued that carefully designed experiments, whether they be in the arts, the sciences, or the humanities, can produce objective truths. Even though such truths may change over time, they're validated at the time that the experiments are completed, and we may proceed with confidence until we're faced with new and conflicting data. Dewey's pragmatic theory of truth, therefore, rejected the common idea that truth is the correspondence between a statement or idea and some fact or state of affairs in reality. In his view, truth is neither discovered, as the absolutists claimed, nor invented, as the relativists claimed. It is instead constructed as a byproduct of the process of solving problems. This conception of truth is basic to the philosophical tradition called pragmatism, with which Dewey is often identified. The central idea of pragmatism is that the meaning or truth of an idea lies in its possible consequences. Dewey thought that truth is like the fit between a key and a lock. There is no absolute key that fits all locks, and not just any arbitrary key will do if you want to open a particular lock. If we want to make a key fit the lock, there are objective conditions that must be taken into consideration. Dewey thought that his pragmatic model of truth was applicable not only to the construction of better outcomes in the natural sciences, but also to experimentation in every area of human life, including social and political institutions. By 1905, Dewey had left Chicago to accept a position at Columbia University in New York City. His appointments were in the Department of Philosophy and at Teachers College. He would remain at Columbia until his retirement at the age of 80 in 1939. During his extensive travels during the 1920s and 30s, Dewey turned his attention more and more to understanding the relationship between the ideals of democracy and cultural diversity. He visited Mexico, China, Japan, Turkey, and the Soviet Union, in addition to many countries in Western Europe. Wherever he went, he was keen to discover whether local institutions, such as schools, promoted democratic forms of association and the growth of individuals. This was a time of great political upheaval, most acutely represented by the rise of fascism in Italy and Germany and communism in the Soviet Union. Unlike some of his academic colleagues, Dewey was drawn to neither ideology. He continued to affirm his faith in democratic ideals, even as he criticized the failure of the American political system to fully realize those goals. One person who knew Dewey at this time is Louise Rosenblatt, who was to become an important influence in the teaching of literature.
And of course, those were the days in the 30s when fascist ways of thinking were becoming very apparent, both abroad and at home, and so that the need to protect and develop democracy became increasingly important, and certainly motivated Dewey and the rest of us who were concerned with education as a force for democracy. Dewey's writings are a constant meditation in one way or another on the idea of democracy as a way of life and not just a set of ideas. Now, of course, it's that ability to think about the consequences to imagine the consequences of your actions, your decisions, and to place yourself in the place of others who will be affected by it, that a person who is a member of a democracy must possess. It's that power of imagination, that ability to resist the either or, the self-interest, and the ability to resist the either-or point of view. Those were ideas that were very much Dewey's, and certainly ones that I tried in my humble way to apply in the field of the teaching of reading.
Dewey had been thinking about these matters for most of his public life. Earlier, in his 1916 book, Democracy and Education, he had written that there were two requirements for democracy.
To the Board of Supervisors meeting, and if you would please all rise and join us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
One requirement is that social control cannot be imposed from above by kings or despots, or even by an enlightened elite. It is instead a recognition of mutual interest by all the people involved.
How do you feel about this hat rule, and what is your position?
Another requirement is that people and the systems they create to live together must be flexible and open to readjustments as circumstances change.
We girls can wear hair clips and bandanas and headbands, and like the boys would want to wear their hats.
You said you can wear your hat. Now let's see what you do. And you watched him. And later on, he was playing with his hat.
In Dewey's view, democracy is not based on a particular political system, but on the continuing commitment of each individual to work to make his or her own life, as well as the lives of his or her fellow citizens, as full and rewarding as possible.
Staff meeting that you guys had, you can say, well, one of the kids gave me this petition that they wrote, and it looks like all of these kids are thinking that our world doesn't work, and then you can give it to the teachers and see what they think, and you can even go farther than that.
In 1939, with Europe already engaged in war and the forces of fascism advancing, Dewey, now 80 years old, wrote, "The democratic faith in human equality is belief that every human being, independent of the quantity or range of his personal endowment, has a right to equal opportunity with every other person for development of whatever gifts he has."
Calypso's meds came from behind the boat and helped me push it into the water.
The aim of education for Dewey is to enable individuals to continue growing throughout their entire lives. Schools must prepare people for more than simply making a living. They must create the desire for richer, more fulfilling experiences.
Is there some way that we
They
can
must
approach
provide
this?
the tools by means of which the viewpoints of others can be understood and conflicts can be resolved. Dewey thought that promotion of the arts played an essential role in the attainment of these goals. He had long rejected the idea that cognitive or intellectual knowing is the only way of experiencing. He had always emphasized the emotional and aesthetic components of successful inquiry. As much as he valued spoken and written language, he also prized the arts. He thought that music, dance, painting, design, and drama were important ways of exploring and communicating the richness of human experiences. Fairly late in life, at the age of 75, he addressed these issues in his book, Art as Experience. It combined two of his major themes. The first was his democratic vision of a society in which all people could develop their talents and be enriched by the talents of others. The second was the importance of the aesthetic dimension of human life. We all live in a sea of experiences, but not all of them are of equal value. Some of them excite more interest than others. Like the child in the candle, we sometimes follow through. We sometimes interact with portions of our environment in ways that make our experiences more meaningful. When this happens, Dewey says we have an experience. One of the ways that we remain open to new experiences is by making and enjoying works of art. Art helps us learn to focus our senses, to hone our sensory powers. It also provides an important means of communication among the many diverse individuals and groups that make up our global village. Dewey thought that even where there is no common spoken language, music and the visual arts can help us communicate across cultures. Music and the other arts are universal languages. During his long life, Dewey continued to insist that even in the face of the most difficult of circumstances, there are still opportunities for enhanced meaning and growth. Despite the cruel losses of two beloved children, harsh criticism of his work, the death of his wife Alice in 1927, and dismay at the horrors of the Great Depression and 2 world wars, he continued to face the future with great hope. He continued to be active as a philosopher and social critic even after his 90th birthday. In 1946, almost 2 decades after the death of Alice, Dewey married Roberta Lowitz Grant. He was then 87, she was 42. Shortly thereafter, the couple adopted 2 young children in whom he delighted. Dewey died at his apartment in New York City on June 20, 1952. Although Dewey's influence waned during the decades that followed his death, his ideas have enjoyed a remarkable resurgence of interest since the mid-1980s. Today, his work is held in high regard by philosophers, historians, political scientists, sociologists, educators, and others. At a recent conference, some young philosophers discussed their research.
There's this great interest in the way that democracy and the work that Dewey did with the development of communities and formation of democratic publics, which is a great interest to people in former Soviet bloc countries. Obviously, they don't have the strong tradition of democracy, and that's why they're quite interested in American philosophy.
Yeah, and that's another interesting way in which Dewey's philosophy is being used today in ways different from it was used, say, 100 years ago, but it's really impacting, having a positive impact on debates going on today and issues that affect all of our lives, animals, gender, race, technology, all of it.
In 1949, on the occasion of his 90th birthday, Dewey was hailed by the New York Times as America's philosopher. Their tribute is as appropriate now as it was then. Even though his theory of learning and his promotion of the method of intelligence are still resisted by some people, they continue to enrich educational systems around the world. His pragmatic theory of truth as a process of discovery honors the experimental and creative capacities of human experience.
Really hard.
Dewey's definition of democracy as belief in the ability of human experience to generate the aims and methods by which further experience shall grow in ordered richness is as fresh and compelling today as when he wrote those words more than a half-century ago.